Hello and welcome to the nervous system. I'm going to do a bit of an overview of the nervous system, and what I'm doing is I'm using the nervous system note sheet, and I'll give you an overview, and we're going to look at the textbook and just define the basic parts first. So when we look at the textbook, the nervous system is shown below, and here's the nervous system. That's not showing up very clearly, is it? Here's the nervous system. The nervous system's job is to interpret and transport information. So the nervous system will coordinate both voluntary action, which is ones you think about, and involuntary action, which are things that automatically happening. And it transmits electrical signals from the receptors. So we have the sensory receptor, which picks up the information. Then it sends it to the brain to be encoded or interpreted. And then it's sent to what's called an effector muscle or organ. So that could be an organ or a gland or something that an action occurs. So when we look at the nervous system, there are two parts to the nervous system. The main part is called the central nervous system, and that is the brain and the spinal cord. Then there's all these extra nerves that come off the brain and spinal cord, and that's called the peripheral nervous system. Signals, the electrical signals that are sent by the nervous system, are called the nervous impulses, and they are specialized signals sent through the nerve in a specialized cell of a nerve called the neuron. And a typical neuron has a long projection on one end and short projections on the other, or at least a motor neuron. So what you have is your cell body with your nucleus in it, and inside your cell body you've got your organelles, your Golgi, and your nucleus, and a lot of endoplasmic reticulum, and a lot of mitochondria, because it takes a lot of energy to transport all the things, the chemicals, to go through the cell. You have the processes coming in, which are called dendrites, and then you have usually one process going out called the axon, and it'll reach the second thing, either another neuron or an organ, at what's called a synaptic terminal. So when we are looking at the nervous system, it is very fast, but it's very short-lived, and the response is very local. But this is a way to communicate in a small amount or in a small way, very specific cells, and very rapid. So you wanted to know the definition of a nerve impulse, and a nerve impulse is the signal transmitted along the nerve fiber. The neuron is the specialized cell that it is sent through. Okay, so we've talked about the nervous impulse, and we've talked about the difference between the central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system. In the central nervous system, that's where the majority of the integration takes place. The peripheral nervous system is picking up information from the outside of the body and sending it to the central nervous system. And then it also collects the impulses and sends it back to activate either a nerve or a muscle or whatever needs to be done. So that's part one, the organization. As we continue on, the next topic are neurons and neuroglia. So these are the two types of cells. The neurons are the cells that transport the nervous signal, and the neuroglia, glia stands for glue, so the neuroglia are the cells that help support and maintain and nourish the neuroglia. Now you may be familiar with neuroglia already in terms of the cells that wrap the axon or the myelinated sheath. So when we look at it, the neuron is the nerve cell. This is the excitable tissue. The neuron has the dendrites that bring things in, the cell membrane, which is the outside. Then you have the cell body, also called the soma. Then you have the process that takes it away, and that is called the axon. Now, the axon is wrapped with this waxy type or lipid type cell, and it's a Schwann cell if it is in the peripheral nervous system, and if it's in the central nervous system, similar, but it's called an oligodendrite. And a Schwann cell and an oligodendrite, which make up what's called the myelin sheath, are neuroglia, and neuroglia are specialized cells to protect and nourish the neuron. So the neuron itself is the structure that sends the signal, and we'll look at the parts, the dendrites, cell membrane, and if you want help, you can go to the interaction here in the textbook and click on each part, and it will give you each of the things that we look at. Okay, now when you look at nervous tissue has gray matter, which is the unmyelinated part, and then it's the white matter. And the white matter is white because of the lipids in the myelin sheath. So it is the part that covers and protects it. Now, in the brain, the white matter's on the inside, the gray matter's on the outside. In the nervous system, the gray matter's in the inside and the white matter's on the outside. When we look at the types of neurons, there are 3 different types. There are sensory, which take the information from the senses to your nervous system, your spinal cord. So an example is your fingers have lots of pressure or heat receptors. So if by accident you say touch a hot stove or anything hot, the heat sensors or temperature sensors in your skin will send the message up your arm, up here, the part of your spinal cord, and then it will be processed in your central nervous system. Then in the central nervous system, there is something called an interneuron. The interneurons are in between the sensory and the motor. So it goes into the spinal cord in the sensory, gets processed in the interneuron, and then it comes out the motor neuron to, say, your muscles, and then you move your hand away from whatever's hot. So that's how the types of neuron work. Sensory goes towards the central nervous system, motor goes away, and interneurons are usually the connectors inside the nervous system. I discussed, it's the neurons that send the message, but it is the neuroglia, or the glue cells, which help transport them. Now, you don't need to know these 6 types at this time, but you may have already heard of them. So in the central nervous system, or in the peripheral nervous system, you may have heard of Schwann cells. And the Schwann cells are what wrap the axon to speed it up and insulate it. In between, there was the nodes of Ranvier. Remember that? Anyway, it is a Schwann cell that wraps it up, named after a dude named Schwann, who is one of the guys to find cells that were living. Now, cells in the central nervous system that perform the similar tasks to Schwann cells are called oligodendrites. And oligo means few. So an oligodendrite cell, see how it wraps a few different places, where a Schwann cell just wraps in one. So oligodendrites help myelinate in the brain and in the spinal cord. Then you have something called an ependymal cell, and the ependymal cell makes cerebral spinal fluid, which we will look at later. It's the fluid that helps protect the brain. Then there's an astrocyte, and astrocytes have these little feet on them, which will connect to the blood supply. And then the other end connects to the nerve. So it's kind of like a transporter to get the nutrients from the blood into the nerve, and that creates what you may have heard of as the blood-brain barrier. And then there's a microglia, which is really small glia. Good. So those are the neuroglia. So if you look at the, you need to list the different types of neuroglia so that you are familiar with their names, but you do not need to memorize it at this time. Good. That is the introduction. I'm going to stop the video here. The next task is the nervous impulse, which is a little tricky. So we'll stop for a little break here, and then have a drink of water before we hit the nervous impulse, because that one's a little trickier.